My name's Emily. I'm the publisher of literature and theatre at CUP, and it's a delight to welcome you all here to celebrate the launch of Lorna's extraordinary book. Back in spring 2021, which now feels a very long time ago, I read a snatch of description of the project online and got in touch with Lorna. My commissioning ears pricked up that this was going to be something really exciting, and Lorna's subsequent description of it convinced me that it would be revelatory in content and just beautifully written in terms of style. It's so lucid and so elegantly executed. For those of you who have yet to have the pleasure of reading it, you're in for a real treat. It shows the power of literary representation in forging and transforming national identity. And it points up the occlusions and effacement of history and what's at stake for us now in those actions. So it's a real delight to have Lorna with us in conversation with Bart van Es. Lorna is Merton Professor of English Literature at Oxford University and is Fellow of the British Academy. Her innovative books include The Usurer's Daughter, The Invention of Suspicion, and Circumstantial Shakespeare. Bart van Es is also Professor of English Literature at Oxford and is Fellow and Senior Tutor of St Catherine's College, Oxford. He is the author of Shakespeare in Company, Shakespeare's Comedies, A Very Short Introduction, and most recently The Cutout Girl, which is a work of creative non-fiction, and the winner of the Costa Book of the Year Award as well. The format of the evening tonight will be a Q&A, a conversation between Bart and Lorna, and then we'll open up for audience Q&A. And then we'll have plenty of time for drinks and snacks, mingling, and Lorna's signed some copies and will be willing to sign some more if you'd like to buy a copy with a 20% discount. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Bart.
Oh, thank you so much, Emily. It's an incredible pleasure to be here. And thank you to CUP for organising this in such a beautiful bookshop. We are particularly envious of bookshops, given that OUP have given theirs up. Lorna and I had a version of this conversation around a year ago when I was one of the very few people who'd read it, and I was overwhelmed then by the way in which it just radically makes you re-see the history of the 16th century and the way in which the literature of that period reflects on that history. I mean, it's very customary for people to start out with an academic project by identifying a gap and saying, well, you know, we've got to fix this gap, and usually that's a kind of level of false outrage around the idea of a gap. Because you're quite pleased that the gap is there. But I think in Lorna's case, she actually feels properly angry about this gap, and rightly so, because the gap that she's really identified is the sustained attempt by the English nation to conquer Scotland through the course of the 16th century, through a series of wars that we've virtually forgotten. First of all, the aggressive expansionist wars of Henry VIII, which have sort of really ludicrously been described as the rough wooing, and then secondarily Somerset under Edward VI, with a second stage of an incredibly brutal, destructive war involving rape on a huge scale, the kind of destruction of crops, the destruction of much of an incredibly prosperous Scottish economy, and the kind of triumph of English propaganda has been to kind of convince people, even now, to think that really the threat was always to England from Scotland, that Scotland is the weasel Scot who will continually be attacking while the English are doing noble things on the continent. And what Lorna's book does is it, first of all, shows with incredible kind of scrupulousness the viciousness of those wars, and then the English propaganda effort to kind of transform those wars into something bizarrely peaceable, and then how that mythos worked its way into English literature, the plays of Shakespeare, and the epic of Spenser's Faerie, Queene in particular. So you can already now tell, I mean, a year ago I think I was one of very few who'd read it. More and more people are having read this book, and it's forcing them to rethink just a huge amount of the narrative of English nationhood. Very important books like kind of Richard Helgenson's Forms of Nationhood, which clearly have been formative to Lorna, but I think look quite dated now when you look at what Lorna's done. So I think, we're going to talk for maybe 20-25 minutes, then there'll be some time for questions. But Lorna, I mean, when did the idea for the book first emerge for you?
Well, I think the idea emerged for me when I was working at the University of St Andrews. Obviously, it just became more and more apparent to me, living in Scotland, and also at that time, which was before the 2014 referendum, that I mean, as I was just saying to you, talking to Rhiannon Purdy, that there was a sort of mismatch in periodization in the way that English literature and Scottish literature are taught. So in Scottish literature, the medieval period goes up to 1560, whereas we tend to start the Renaissance in 1500. And so this kind of mismatch made me wonder why no one ever talked about the literatures, why no one ever talked about Scottish literature in the 16th century. I mean, why did it sort of disappear? And then I was reading more about Scottish nationhood, or the wars of Edward I, producing a kind of Scottish sense of national myth and national identity, opposing the English arguments of overlordship, which derive from Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain from 1137. That's actually a story about Welsh British indigeneity, but it becomes adapted by English kings as an argument of English overlordship ab initio, to produce a kind of mono-national idea of Britain.
Yeah.
And the Scots responded in the time of Edward I, and before it actually, with their own histories derived from the Irish ones, but also with their own additions. And so in that period, there was a kind of war of historiography, as James Goldstein talks about it, and it's quite obvious. You know that there's a real war, and you also know that there are different stories and that they're at war. So what seemed so strange to me was that in the Elizabethan period, there is no kind of Scotland and England. There is no discussion. There is no sense of this opposition.
Yeah.
And so Scotland seemed to have disappeared. And I called that the myth of indifference. The myth that somehow everyone sort of knew that James was going to be born and come south, and there was going to be Britain. And it was all fine. And nobody minded. And nobody was bothered about Scotland. And what I feel about indifference is that it's actually a very powerful affective strategy. You know that if you desire something or someone, to pretend indifference, to feign indifference, makes it seem as though all the desire is on their side. So Scottish ideas of being a nation, Scottish ideas of sovereignty always seem excessive and partisan, whereas England appears to be unbothered by having a land border with another sovereign kingdom in the same island.
Or even to sort of ignore it altogether and imagine itself as an island. England imagines itself to be surrounded by sea somehow.
That imagining actually doesn't predate Elizabeth's reign. That is a really powerful. I mean, the other thing about the book is that I don't really feel it's just critique, like literature is bad, literature is mythic. I think it's really a way of understanding what artifice there was in the idea of England as an island. It emerges at this point precisely to counter the idea of England having to fight Scotland. So if I can put it this way, in the 1540s, the English used the Golfridian history, the Geoffrey of Monmouth's history, in order to argue that they were overlords and that therefore an invasion was perfectly justified. There was nothing illegal about it. Scotland was a vassal state. They then lost that war, And so after that period, they found new ways of laying claim to the seas around the whole island by making Scotland, as it were, sort of disappear territorially. So, I mean, for people who know about English literature and literary criticism, I think they may be familiar with new historicists who often talk about Elizabeth as virgin and the idea of a kind of idea of a chaste virgin in an island, and there was a new iconography of Elizabeth as virgin in the island. They understand the Queen's body, the Elizabeth as virgin thing, as a kind of artifice, but they don't understand that the island is also artifice. You know, it isn't an island. They're very aware of a sovereign territory to the north.
I mean, you use the Marcus Gerhardt's portrait. I mean, it's beautifully illustrated, the book as well. The wonderful kind of centerfold of the coloured things. And Marcus Gerhardt's famous Ditchley portrait, where the Queen is kind of sitting on the land. And you talk very wonderfully about portraits in the book. I mean, could you tell us a bit about what Gerhardt's is kind of up to in framing her like that?
Yeah, it's an amazing portrait. So Elizabeth is standing, and people always say this is the beginning of a kind of cartographic awareness of land and space. So she's standing on the Saxton maps of Oxfordshire, in fact, and you can see the map of Oxford at her feet, and you can see the edge, the crucial southern coast, which makes England an island, because the crucial coast is, you know, with France. And then the shape of her whole body it gives you the sense of the island of Britain. It looks like the island of Britain, and then and the cartouche says, you know, the Queen of the island, and Roy Strong and other people all say the Queen is the island, she is England, she is the island. And you think, wait a minute, this is 1592. So there is quite a lot of territory behind her back, as it were, if you imagine that, you know, behind her ruff, which is a different sovereign kingdom. And so is this just the myth of indifference? In other words, we didn't really mind, and we know that James is coming south. Or is it an imperial image? And I think it's an imperial image. I think it's a peaceable image, but an imperial one. And I think you can see that because when James does come south, everybody says, Great Britain? What's that? We don't want that. But that's because it's coming from Scotland, because before, during the wars in the 1540s, Great Britain was the key. That's when the term was invented. Yeah. It was invented as an ideology of a fraternal union, in spite of the fact that they thought that the Scots were a vassal nation. So
all the time you show that there's actually this incredible level of violence that's going on that is being kind of occluded by a rhetorical effort to deny that violence, and that's going on under Elizabeth, where, I mean, again, I'd sort of assumed that you have this picture that you know, Mary Queen of Scots flees to a peaceful England from this kind of totally deranged Scottish wilderness.
Amount of truth in that, yeah.
Well, but it is. But what you show is that wilderness has been created by England because it's constantly bringing incursions in. It's deliberately funding these civil wars. It's an active policy to create an unstable Scotland. It's not just a kind of you know, a wild land that's out there.
I mean, there is Scottish complicity in that. So I suppose with that you might think, you know, the question we always ask is, was Mary guilty of murdering Darnley? You know, that's not the right question. Frankly, there wasn't a Scottish nobleman who wasn't involved in the murder of Darnley. Everybody knew about it. But the question is, you know, why did she have to be framed like that? Why did she have to be singled out? And the answer is that when she fled south, the Earl of Murray, her half-brother, who was having English support, was suddenly, before Elizabeth, having to explain why he had deposed the Queen. Now, that's treason, you know, so he had to come up with reasons. Now, Buchanan had just written on the law of kingship among the Scots to say that Scots had always deposed monarchs and tyrants, and that was fine. But obviously that wasn't going to cut a lot of ice with Elizabeth. So Murray needed more help from Buchanan, and Buchanan proceeded to write a detection of the doings of Mary Queen of Scots, where he proved that Mary was a sort of Senecan tyrant.
Yeah.
And so it's that crucial text, which links with his other text, which proves that the murder of Darnley was not a political event, but was the result of her crazed, you know, erotic infatuation with Bothwell. I mean, she wasn't entirely sensible in marrying him, but you know, the text then produces this shame of her, but it also subordinates Scotland to England's jurisdiction. And the supporters of Mary, who weren't all Catholics, but were noblemen and lairds who wanted to have their monarch restored and wanted to have, you know, Scotland as sovereign again, they were very angry about this text because they didn't believe that Scotland should be subordinated to English jurisdiction. Meanwhile, William Cecil, who was writing memoranda, was linking England's right of jurisdiction here back to the Geoffrey of Monmouth arguments that England had always had that right because Scotland was a vassal nation. So this stuff sort of continues, and yes, and the person who led the invasions into Scotland at that time and burnt down the houses of the Maitlands and various other people was Lord Hunsdon, who later became Shakespeare's patron. So I think there's quite a lot of you know, continuity there too.
Yeah, I mean, going back then a bit from the Elizabethan period, you were going to give us a reading, I think, and the book is beautifully written from that forgotten history, the kind of Somerset campaigns, I think. This is, or is it?
Yes,
yeah.
no, this is so. So Henry VIII invaded Scotland and wrote a declaration about how he had a right to because he was its overlord, and this was based on the idea that Mary, Queen of Scots, had been promised to Edward VI. It's not that the Scots were upset about that, but that Henry just demanded immediate custody of Mary, demanded that she come south, and wasn't going to concede any rights. He was just behaving like the King of Scotland, so they weren't accepting that. So he invaded. But then when he died in 1547, and there were some really brutal campaigns with the blowing up of the monastery of Kelso Abbey and the border abbeys. And for example, when they were retreating and they went to Dunbar, they just burnt everybody as they slept, for example. So it was really very, very brutal. And the Earl of Hertford burnt and destroyed, as he put it, 287 abbeys, castles, towns, villages, and he produced these accounts where he added them all up, all the abbeys, monasteries, and towns and villages that he burnt. But then, in 1547, when Henry died, the Scots were hoping for peace. Unfortunately, Hertford had now become the Earl of Somerset, and he was determined to really conquer Scotland, so with garrisons and so on. But what's really interesting here is that he was very keen to persuade them that he came in peace. So he had these proclamations which were to go before the army and to be pinned up on church doors and everywhere. And people were to read the proclamation and they were to accept that the English army came in peace. And if they didn't accept that, they were going to, you know, their buildings were going to be burnt down and so on. So this is the bit of the text of the proclamation, if I can just read this out. So we, upon the aforesaid godly considerations, are now come into this realm, not as an enemy to the Queen or any of the realm that mind the perfection of peace in conjunction of the marriage of both princes, but as a friend and conservator of them. And we are come in this manner, which pretendeth a force in appearance, but not in deed, only to defend and maintain the honour of both the princes. Nor we mind by conjunction of this marriage to do any more prejudice to this realm of Scotland than to that of Britain, than to that of England, but to unite them together by the name of Britons. So this is a fascinating temporal and causal game, because the proclamation anticipates, as the occasion of its utterance, the encounter between the invaded and invader. Imagine it. The core of this invading army consists of 3 battles of 3,000 and 4,000 footmen each, led by the Lord Protector himself, along with John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, and Thomas Lord Dacre. These 3 infantry battles, 10,000 altogether, are followed by a mounted force of 2,000 light horse, 4,000 fully armed heavy cavalry, including Burgundian and Spanish mercenaries, 200 Italian hackbutters on horseback, that is, mounted firearm troops of the most modern kind, led by the Spaniard Sir Pedro de Gamboa. This state-of-the-art armed forces are accompanied by 15 pieces of great ordnance and victuals carried in 900 carts, along with 1,400 pioneers who, captained by Sir John Brend, are ready to dig the fortifications to be devised by Sir Richard Lee veteran engineer of Boulogne and early Scottish campaigns. It's this battlefield-ready, prepared to fortify host that proclaims at every single encounter on its march through Scotland that it pretends a force in appearance but not in deed, and that all this force serves merely to chastise those who oppose giving England the custody of Scotland's Queen. The metaleptic plot of causation has already been laid, so that the army can be nothing other than a friend and conservator of British unity and peace, no matter what it does to those whom it deems to be against that unity and peace. And going up through the north, William Patten describes how they encounter 3 castles, none of whom opposed Somerset, but they didn't actively accept that it was in peace either, and so they were all blown up.
So you brilliantly fill in this history, but then the subtlety of the book is then also this close reading of literature that follows on from that. I mean, you have this wonderful way of describing the Faerie Queene in particular as a kind of poetic solvent through which the contradictory logic of Elizabethan Anglo-British imperialism is kind of brought together into something unified. I mean, could you talk about what the Faerie Queene is doing with that history?
This is from your work, Bart, when you talk about chorography and how it's in the present. So Bart, in his wonderful book, Spenser and the Forms of History, talks about how the new form of chorography, which is attending to the antiquities in the land, rather than, so instead of narrating history, what you're doing is allowing history to come up through the antiquities in the land, so the ancientness of the land. And Bart talks about that in book 3 in the Legend of Chastity, when Britomart goes to Merlin and
Dehubath.
Yes. Well, so I see that as very, very important in Spenser's brilliant rethinking of the Golfridian story. So in Spenser has King Arthur as his hero, right? And Arthur is from Geoffrey of Monmouth. Geoffrey of Monmouth's book describes the division of Britain again and again by Gorboduc, by Lear, by other silly kings who divide it. And then finally we have Arthur who, defeats the Saxons, defeats the Scots, defeats the Picts, and reunites Britain under himself, and then he goes off and conquers the world, including Rome. So Spenser has Arthur read his own history, the history of Britain, in the Chamber of Memory, in book 2, and he's reading, and then he comes to his own moment, and the book stops. So it's now Arthur's time. And that moment is when Uther is about to try and beat the Saxons who've invaded, and the Scots and the Picts, but Uther is ill and he can't. So book 3 then begins with Uther being ill and flaming torches all over Britain land. And so you think this is going to be it, this is going to be Arthur now beating the Saxons, instead of which Spenser produces a kind of erotic island chorography where a British princess, princess, Britomart, sees a lover in a mirror that is designed to warn her father against invaders. So, sea invaders. And then this story comes from a poem attributed to Virgil, which is about a thalassocrat or sea king, Minos, who invades a sea kingdom because the daughter falls in love with Minos. And the other person in the poem is someone called Britomartus, who jumps off a cliff to get away from Minos. So what Spenser does is he reconfigures this story as the plot of chastity, and the chastity is linked to the coastline so coastlines suddenly appear in book 3 of the Faerie Queene, where there weren't many coastlines before. So you had sort of Neptune and the offshore interests, as it were, of England. And all of this is linked to the fact that chastity requires kind of contradictory imperatives of, on the one hand, your coastline has to be secure against invasion. On the other hand, if you're going to have a sea empire, you have to go out there and trade and have commerce. And so Britomart and Florimel are these two contradictory aspects of chastity. And and it's all about coastlines because, Britomart meets this knight of the coastline, Marinel, and unhorses him and causing a diplomatic incident. And the resolution of that is at a big marriage of the Thames and Medway, which is a big estuary, sort of big celebration of the Navy, really. And all the rivers of the world get to come. And Florimel is released from her seawall prison. And the only rivers, the Irish rivers come because they're from a nearby kingdom. The only rivers that don't appear are the rivers of Scotland. They're just not there. So this is what I see as an erasure chorographically of the inland of Scotland. So it's been reduced to a coastline, which is the coastline of England. And I think this continues because if you read Selden and the Mare Clausum, it is all about England claiming the British seas.
So you repeat it. I've got so little time, but I want to sort of show a bit how you continue looking at that kind of erasure, because you look at Shakespeare really in three ways, don't you? You look at the English history plays, then you look at Lear, and finally you look at Macbeth. And the English history plays, you know again that the Scots kind of disappear from them, that we hear about Agincourt and Henry V. What kind of Shakespeare excludes is the Scottish element of that, which again I hadn't known about, but tell us a bit about that.
Well, in Holinshed and Hall, I mean, Scotland really is a kingdom, and there really is concern about it. And of course, there is a very strange situation. I mean, you could say maybe Shakespeare omits it for this reason, but I don't think it's this reason, that Robert III refused to acknowledge Henry IV, but anyway, Robert III's son, James, was being sent to France for safekeeping. Unfortunately, pirates in Norfolk got him, and Henry IV took him prisoner, which was really quite illegal, but anyway, he did. So Scotland's King James, the first James, not the sixth James, who's called the first James, was a prisoner of Henry IV, and what Henry V did was, after Agincourt, when the French were getting back on their feet, partly through Scottish help, Henry V thought a really good wheeze would be to take James I with him to fight his own people. And so at the siege of Melun, James was made to fight the Scots, and the Scots were defeated, and the noble prisoners were hanged instead of being ransomed, which would be normal according to the laws of war. But Henry argued that they were rebellious subjects. Now, they argued they hadn't been sworn to James because he hadn't been crowned, and that they belonged to Scotland. So, and that the king was not their king yet. So so this is quite interesting, because Shakespeare's Henry V is a play whose sort of national imagining is powerful precisely because it's not jingoistic. It's actually about questions like, how can you have a just war? So it is precisely about the questions of the ethics of war and the justice of war. And Henry V himself was involved in that kind of theatre of war and sort of making it seem just in this way, but actually in a way committing a war crime.
This is going to have to be my last question, because we want to have questions from the audience as well. But I think Lear is really the crowning of the book, isn't it?
It was the most difficult part.
Yeah, it's such a kind of complex analysis that you do in Lear. One of the things you seem to do there is to, first of all, think intertextually about the way that story is working against all sorts of other plays depicting questions of English versus Scottish sovereignty, things like the misfortunes of Arthur. But you also, I think, sort of do really interesting things with how the play relates to questions of the rights of Scots at the time of the Union debate. So can you tell us a bit about what's going on in Lear as far as the creation of an insular England?
Okay, I think maybe the two things that might be most useful to say. The first is, Lear was in a way the thing that got me thinking about this altogether, because John Kerrigan's wonderful Archipelagic English says that on the one hand, Lear seems like it must be a topical play because it's written at this time and it's about the division. On the other hand, you don't want to reduce it to topicality. And I was very bothered by that idea of reduction to topicality. I'm thinking, is Scotland just topical then? Does it just appear, Yeah. And so I feel that what I've tried to do in that chapter is to say, and then the whole book, is to say that in writing Lear, Shakespeare's working with a Golfridian history that is deeply, deeply enmeshed in everything, so that there's nothing sort of new about this, but that also different genres deal with Gulfridian history in different ways. So we've seen Spenser with Arthur, but tragedy emerged in England, classical tragedy, Senecan tragedy, Oedipal Seneca on Oedipus, emerged through adapting the British materials to the House of Thebes. So I think that's very important. So the House of Thebes, the story of Jocasta and Oedipus and their warring sons, is a perfect way of adapting the British material of the division of the kingdom to an affective structure of national imagining as sort of familial. So the land becomes the womb, as it were, of Jocasta, and the warring people who are destroying the kingdom are, you know, Ferrex and Porrex, or Lear's children. So, and the weird thing that Lear does is that Shakespeare has Goneril and Regan die childless, whereas the whole point of the Gulfridian history is that they have sons who war again and who fight Cordelia and who bring about the British history. So that when the fool jokes that Merlin will say this because he lives before his time, that's an impossible joke, because Goneril and Regan have died childless. So there can be no British history. So I feel that Shakespeare is in a way evacuating and destroying this the Gulfridian history at that point.